Thank you. Not all lawyers are bad. Look at Mr. Hogan earlier today. Gave an excellent presentation.
I'm a lawyer.
Kia ora koutou. My name's Michael Sharp. I'm speaking on behalf of the State Housing Action Network. So we're a network of organisations that promote the use of state provision of social houses in New Zealand. And what I'm speaking to about you today is the role of provision of state houses in dealing with the housing unaffordability crisis that we have at the moment in this country. So, if I'll just open up my map here. With me look at what the housing unaffordability issue is in New Zealand at the moment, we can see in very simplistic terms from this chart here.
Like that, since you like to refer, just
yes.
returning so that Facebook can hear.
Sure. So as you can see, if we go back to 30 years ago, we had similar sort of income to price housing affordability as other comparable countries in OECD. And then up to now, we've just rocketed to the top of the ladder. So we're now 7, our closest neighbour is 6, other comparable countries about 4 and 5. Now that's the general position, but it's spread worse in other parts of the countries. I'm from Tauranga, and we're at 9.3. So on this demographica survey that done, we're the 5th most unaffordable city in the world on this survey. And just when you just look at what the sort of houses like when I bought when I was first bought my first house, it was a $90,000 house in about 1991, so about the start of that. I was on a salary of $30,000. That same house, now last I looked, would be worth about $900,000, and my comparable salary now would be under $50,000. So that sort of ratio has gone up to about 15 for someone like in my position coming out of university and so on. So that's the crisis that we are facing in New Zealand and we have to deal with. Now, I guess the question is looking forward, because they're looking forward to our future in Aotearoa, is will this change? Will this get worse? What's going to happen? So I'm not an expert, I'm not a housing economist, but the likelihood of what the signals are is that it will get worse. We've just seen coming out of COVID, coming into recession, that the housing market is reckoning up again. Like it's totally insane, right? And when you look at what's driving the housing market, there all seems to be increasing in the future. We've got this intervention by central banks in the financial markets, pumping money in, lowering interest rates. That's just getting worse post-COVID. We've got a lack of capital gains tax, which is and that is the characteristics which is individually to New Zealand. All the rest of these countries have capital gains tax. We don't. So that may be, or seems to be, the driving factor of the difference between us and the rest of the world. And we've had different debates about capital gains tax, but the present Prime Minister has personally vetoed the capital gains tax during her political career, which looks to be quite long. So we're not going to see that in the future for some time. So where does that take us in as far as how are we going to deal with the unaffordability of houses in New Zealand? So what it's going to inevitably result is more and more people can't afford to buy a house. More and more people will have to rely on government support. Now, in this country, we have in effect a type of social contract where if you're on a low income, you can't afford a house, then you can put your name down for social housing. While you're waiting for social housing, you can get emergency housing or interim housing. So basically, we have an underwriting of this country to provide people with a house so they can't afford it. So where are we at the moment with that? So this is the waiting list for social housing in New Zealand. So you see we've gone from March 2017, where it's under 5,000, up to the present, where it's 16,000. So these are historic highs. Like historically, it's hardly ever got over 5,000, but the last few years it's absolutely rocketed up. So this is a signal, and this is an indication of the amount of people in this country who can't afford a house and who need government assistance. So, given that we have this need for government assistance, what is being provided? Is it sufficient? Now, yesterday I heard Megan Woods, the Minister for Housing, talking about the current government's housing policy, and her view is that they have over-delivered on public housing and provided the most public housing in a generation. Well, personally, I do have a few issues with that spin. Now, the current government housing plan is a 2018 public housing plan, and that's a budget to provide 1,600 new public housing places every year, with 75% of them to be provided by the government and 25% by community housing providers. Now, that's basically the same public housing plan that the national government had before them. When this government came into power, the Housing Ministry recommended to the Minister that be stepped up to 2,000, but apparently focused on Kiwi Build, they left it as it was at 1,600. Now, what's happened in the meantime is that the budget has been actually over-delivered. We've got about 1,900 social housing places a year, but less than half of those have been provided by the government. So the government has provided under budget. Community housing providers have stepped up given the increased demand, and they are now providing the bulk of the new social housing in this country. So historically, what the actual government is doing, rather than being historic highs, as the Minister claimed, is really quite modest. They're providing under 1,000 public housing units a day through Aotearoa, and the government was providing far more than that during the 2000s, and certainly far more than that leading up to World War II. Now, there was the welcome announcement of the social housing in the 2020 budget, and that basically looked at doubling what the social housing placements were going to be. But although it was in the budget, there was no money allocated to that. So what the government said is that those places are to be provided through a combination of community housing providers and Aotearoa. So there was no central government funding. It's more or less a target that they hope and expect that those other agencies will step up. So, is the government response to the housing crisis through social housing sufficient? In my view, it's not. It needs a lot of improving. The first issue is that there's a continued reliance on the provision of private community housing providers to step into the breach. Now, that is internationally recognised as having problems and issues. The ideal model is the government to supply most of the social housing and the community housing providers to supplement that. And really the problem is that community housing providers, even if they are charities, what they do is that they still have to operate a commercial model. For example, I live in Tauranga, where all the social housing is owned by a private community housing provider, and they operate completely commercially. If a tenant is causing trouble or an issue with them, they just give them notice to leave the house, and there's nothing they can do about it, and there's very little social wraparound. Now, the second issue is that we need far more social houses than to be delivered. So even if the 2020 budget is delivered, and we provide about 3,000 social houses a year, then this will only slow down but not decrease the amount of social housing, and which shows no sign of abating. So what is really required is that the government needs to really step up and provide a lot more social housing themselves. Now, in a recent 2019 OECD economic survey, it was noted that our social housing stocks are low on an international scale. So they're low compared with these other comparative countries. Even now, our housing affordability is a lot worse. And the economic consultancy Infometrics, they recently called upon the government post-COVID to start building about 10,000 social houses a year as part of a response package. Now, this is the only sort of investment that the government can make which will address what is an ongoing crisis in housing affordability in this country. Now, if we do not take these steps, then what we do is we face a future where more and more people will be housed in temporary accommodation like they are at the moment. So, for example, where I come from, Tauranga, where social housing is very hard to find, we have people living in hotels and motels for well over a year. That in itself is very expensive. It costs often about $1,500 or so a week, and it has serious social consequences on those involved. Just to note, we talked about what's been happening post-COVID with dealing with the homeless people, and they're going into hotels. And really the reason why that was happening is because all the hotels were empty, so they were able to find places in the hotels post-COVID. When we come out of COVID, when those hotels fill up, those people will go back onto the streets. So overall, the message that we have from the State Housing Action Network is to address the ongoing effects of housing and affordability. What is required is the government to face the reality that they must step up and shoulder the burden of the downstream effects of the country's mania for housing speculation, which has led to a historic high of those who cannot afford housing. And that challenge, in particular, falls upon the current government. Kia ora.
Tēnā koe, Michael. Yeah, thank you so much for your mahi. It's really very challenging to see these, when you see a graph like this, you can't avoid it, can you? It's very clear to see the disparities. And I was reading in a conversation on Twitter the other day, what was the number one issue for people, that they're thinking about at the moment, and it came back overwhelmingly as housing. And these weren't necessarily people who needed houses themselves, but they recognised that is a measure of how successful our country is at looking after its people. And if, as Frank said, safe, affordable and secure housing is going to affect our tamariki and poverty and all of those things that are connected. Anyway, thank you so much for your mahi. Amazing. Kia ora.